I'm about to turn the heat up on you a little bit. I want to ask you this. When Christians come up to you and say that all these verses and all these passages in the New Testament, like, Jesus is carrying his cross is so much like Isaac carrying his wood, the only begotten son. Joseph is getting sold for 30 shekels, so is Jesus by Judas, where Joseph is sold by Judah. And all these things that are happening in the Old Testament seem to point to Jesus. What is your response to that?
What does Paul do in Romans chapter 10, verse 8? He takes a scalpel and he cuts out the last words that you may do it, which is the whole point, and deletes it. Gone. Disappeared. How do you play with the Bible? How do you literally excise the whole point of the text? What are you doing? And if you're going to play with my Bible, you think I'm going to be a Christian? You think I'm going to convert to Christianity?
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm with the one and only, the Rabbi, Tovia Singer, who is a superstar when it comes to my Patreon members and people who watch this channel. They love when the Rabbi comes by and gives us some knowledge. And today we're going to jump into a topic that can't be spoken about enough. There's always something to say. There's always more to say about this because there's just so much of this going on. And that is the Christians who come along, people like Paul, people like Peter, people like whoever, the church fathers and Clement of Alexandria and whoever it is. It's this Greek type of Judaism that's going on. My question is for you, somebody who is a practicing rabbinic Jew, who is a rabbi, who lives this stuff, who lives and breathes the Torah, the Tanakh, you're the real deal. So I got to ask you, I can't be the authority on this. I got to go to you for this. What is it that the Christians are getting wrong about the scriptures, about the Tanakh? What is it that, because they claim to have the fulfillment of the Old Testament? Tell us about that, and what are they getting wrong, and what are they trying to pull off here?
Right. So the Christians, in a sense, are not getting it wrong, as though they're trying and just not achieving the goal. They're making it all up. Let me give you, that means there was never an attempt to get it right, but rather it was a complete scam of the church, where they had to then go back with bleach to the crime scene, wipe away the fingerprints, get rid of the DNA evidence, but they did just a very poor job. It's worse than your viewers think. Let me give you like a very simple example, a very famous example. Luke chapter 24, verse 44. Now, why is that passage so important? It appears right at the end of the third gospel, because Jesus is speaking here following his putative resurrection. And he's saying that what he has done is a fulfillment of the Torah, of the prophets, the Nevi'im, and of the Psalms, which means really the Ketuvim, the writing. That's all of Tanakh. The word Tanakh is just an acronym for the Torah, Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. I'm right there. And then in verse 45, he says, just turn to the scripture. And in 46, he says that he suffered, died, rose on the third day, according to the scripture. There is no such verse. It's a complete phantom. So it's not like it was mistranslated, like famously Matthew mistranslate a whole series of passages in the Hebrew Bible. It just made up, completely made up. There is no passage like that. Paul also makes the same, advances the same idea. No doubt that whoever wrote this pericope of Luke took it from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul says that Jesus rose on the third day according to the scripture. There is no such scripture. It doesn't even exist. So this is not like people had a misunderstanding, or this was a heterodox or heretical sect of Judaism. It
Mm.
wasn't any of that. The idea that you should eat the body and drink the blood of the Messiah by eating the bread and drink, that's not a misunderstanding. That's not a whoops. That's not, oh, I must have gotten some verse wrong there.
Mm.
There's no even beginning. There's nothing remotely resembling that in the Hebrew Bible. Quite the contrary. It is human sacrifice is the motherlode of bad ideas as far as the Torah is concerned. The notion that you should eat now, and let not the Protestants go, well, we only see it as a figure. It doesn't make a difference if it's the way Calvinists view the Eucharist or the way the Roman Catholic Church. The idea, it's just a non-starter. There's nothing remotely resembling that. So it's not like Christianity is sort of a movement of Judaism, and they kind of didn't get it right. There was no even attempt to get it right. There is an attempt, as I said, for people to come back to the crime scene, like the guy who murdered those 4 students in Idaho, where he
Mhm.
kept revisiting, but he didn't go to get his stuff, and they're able to trace him down. It's just them going back and trying to adjust things and go, this is a sect of Judaism. It never was.
Wow. So, what do you think they're trying to bring the Greek-speaking Jewish people of, let's say, Alexandria, for example, to try to bring them into the world of Roman paganism? Is that what you think's happening here?
No, it's Christianity converting to Rome rather than Rome converting to Christianity. What Christianity successfully did was accumulate all the ideas that were well known and widely accepted in the pagan world, and then just put it in some using Jewish terms like Messiah, misappropriating Jewish general concepts. There's no
Right.
attempt, but there's no attempt by the iterate anything resembling the iteration of Christianity that we see now. It is it's certain that there were early Jewish sects. Their writings don't survive. Ebionites, Nazarenes, what we know about them from the church fathers, that there were sects that did think that you needed to keep the Torah, that utterly rejected Paul. We know that because Paul, essentially, in all of his writings, both those that are indisputably from his hand and those that are pseudepigrapha, Paul is arguing with fellow Christians about doctrine. So there was some group that probably that thought that he was a great man, and they came to understand that he was the Messiah. But Christianity it's not a failed attempt. They never tried.
Interesting. Now, does someone like Paul, is there, I mean, do you see people like Paul at all within, rabbinical Judaism, sort of, or is this something completely foreign to what you're doing, to what you're?
No, Paul is completely Hellenistic,
Mhm.
dualistic. I know there are many people who think that Gnosticism, which is rooted in dualism, began in the 2nd century. Christian Gnosticism. It's not that they're not correct. They're not seeing the dualism that's all over Paul's writings. His view of the resurrection of the dead is utterly pagan. So, just so the viewers understand this, in the Greco-Roman world, although they had a respect for Judaism, Judaism, as an example, was a recognized religion, a licit, licensed religion of the Roman Empire, and the Romans respected Judaism for a number of reasons. The one thing the one of a few things they really couldn't stand, didn't like, and expressed it is the Jewish notion of a physical resurrection. In the dualistic world, it's that polluted stream that Manichaeism drank from, Gnosticism drank from, um, Marcionite thinking emerged from. It's all the same thing. The idea is simply that this world, the physical world, was created by by a lower god, by an inferior god, or even a malevolent god in the Gnostic view, and that no one was returning back to the physical body. The physical body is what you need to escape from. Now, there was in this thinking an afterlife, and people really looked forward to that afterlife, but the afterlife was completely spiritual. You know, when Socrates when he drank the hemlock, he was delighted to be finished with this body. Cicero, in his 6-volume Public, writes about how we're done with this physical world. He was perplexed by the Jewish belief, and that's what we find in probably Paul's most famous chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection chapter, where Jesus, certainly Paul is claiming resurrect from the dead, but not to the physical body that he came from. So that's what Paul was from. You mentioned Alexandria.
Yeah.
Has anything godly ever come from Alexandria? Anything? Alexandria is where the doctrine of the Trinity emerged from. I mean, North Africa, it's not just Carthage, where Tertullian coined the term, but that's where the thinkers, the people who shaped the doctrine of Trinity and who advocated for the doctrine of Trinity, that's where they emerged from. In fact, at the Council of Nicaea, the stars there, the star councils that were there, were Alexandrian bishop, Alexandrian thinkers. These are the people that are advancing these pagan ideas that emerge as the orthodoxy in the church. So there's in Judaism, the resurrection is physical. The physical world is a good thing. We're created in the image of God. The notion that the physical world is revolting or sinful or is created by a lower God is completely antithetical to anything Jewish. So the physical resurrection is very important. In the ancient world, in the dualistic world, the celestial bodies were beautiful, perfect, symmetry in the physical world. I mean, imagine, Neil, what it was like to live in the ancient world. People just died and didn't know why. People who appeared healthy were dead 3 months later. They didn't know an infection was. They didn't know any of these things. So they saw the world around them as broken bodies, broken bones, and broken wheels. They couldn't explain any of it. So they thought that this world was certainly that was the world of Paul. Paul wanted to just be removed into the clouds in First Thessalonians chapter 4 in the rapture of the church. The idea was that this don't if you're married, be good to your spouse, but it's best to be like me and be celibate. And I mean, First Corinthians chapter 7. I mean, you hear stuff like that run. So these ideas are utterly antithetical to the Jewish faith. The resurrection is a physical resurrection. Isaiah chapter 22, verse 19, Daniel 12, verse 2. So Paul is what he's doing is he's taking Jewish passages and reinterpreting them violently, viciously, in order to produce his Christology, which won out at the end. Just a comment on this. This is uncharted territory. What the church will do is, although Paul wins, Paul defeats his interlocutors. I'll rephrase that. Paul's Christology was the Christology that the orthodoxy of the church would embrace, and they will reject his opponents. This is the one area that Paul lost in that Paul is advancing the idea that the resurrection is a spiritual body. It's something different than what the mortal body that a person had. But the church would ultimately abandon that. It's the one area that Paul didn't win in. And we see in Matthew and Luke, and as we creep later in the Gospels are going out of their way to distance themselves from that idea. So, for instance, in the chapter we discussed earlier, in Luke chapter 24, it's very important for the author of Luke to say, here, Jesus has now appeared to the disciples in Jerusalem, and he's eating burnt fish with them. And he's saying, look, does a spirit eat and drink as I do with you? Where did that come from? That's certainly not in Mark, because there's no real resurrection appearance in Mark. That the last 12 passages are invented. And then when we get to John, probably written 10, 15 years after Luke, and I'm being very conservative here, we have doubting Thomas, who's actually able to touch the flesh of Jesus. Like, where did that come from? That doesn't appear in earlier Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels. So what they're doing is, in that one area, the church is backtreading, distancing themselves from the idea that Paul, that the resurrected body is spiritual. The church likes the idea of a physical resurrection, and they're going to go with that. That's the one area that Paul lost in.
Interesting, because there's actually quite a few verses in the Greek where he actually uses the word. And for example, he talks about gnosis, and I'm looking at this verse right here where he says, knowing all the mysteries in all gnosis, if I have faith as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. Now, what kind of language is that? Is that something we see? Like, Paul claims to be a Pharisee from the line of Gamaliel. Now, you're familiar with the teachings of Gamaliel. Does this make sense? Does this line up at all? What's your thoughts on that?
The word mystery doesn't really even appear anywhere in Tanakh. This is uniquely Pauline. It doesn't even appear in the Gospels. But this is huge in Paul, that there's special knowledge. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 3, Colossians chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 51. Paul says, in fact, listen, this is like so mind-blowing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8, Paul says that this is a grand mystery. The whole notion that the Messiah is supposed to die and resurrect, like, that's, no one knew that. This is a grand mystery. And he says, if the rulers of the epoch had known the truth about the Lord of glory, they would have never crucified Jesus. That's mind-blowing. You understand what he's saying? This is very Pauline. This is one of the reasons why I am convinced, contrary to what most scholars believe, I'm convinced that books like Colossians and Ephesians in particular are Pauline. He may have had a scribe a secretary who wrote them, so there's a little different, some vocabulary variances there. But this idea penetrates Colossians, is all over Ephesians, and is all over the indisputed letters of Paul. The key is that there's special knowledge. That's what is the Gnostic movement about? That there's special knowledge where you can escape this world and go into better world,
Right.
That's what it's all about. That this world is created by some lower God. Paul says that this is a grand mystery. Incidentally, if theology could be taught that there's a grand mystery, then what religion could be dismissed? Then why, and I want to speak to the Christians watching me right now, why do you reject then the Church of the Latter-day Saints? Maybe Joseph Smith, this is a grand mystery that Joseph Smith was able to find only through a special revelation of the angel Moroni. Then what claim could be dismissed? The Torah has in it a fail-safe system. Torah simply says you can't add to it or take away from it. And if anybody comes along and takes away from it, kill him. He's a false prophet. That's baked into Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. That's baked into Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 1, or the last passage of Deuteronomy chapter 12, depending if you use a Jewish or Christian Bible, respectively. So the Torah is written in the following way. No one can add to this message. And if anyone comes along and tells you any doctrine that's different than what you're reading here, that what your fathers know, Deuteronomy 13, verse 5, 6, and 7, he's a false prophet. So you can't, the Torah is built in a way, it's structured in a way that no one can add to it. There are no new commandments in the book of Isaiah, not one. There's nothing new in Jeremiah. Isaiah and Jeremiah are both saying, get your act together, and this is what you're doing wrong. But there's nothing, they're introducing nothing. There's no new commandment, and there's no new idea. So this idea of mystery is all over Ephesians. It's all over Romans, it's all over Colossians, it's all over. For the idea is that there's a grand mystery that no one knows about. Now, think about this. Neil, missionaries are going to tell you, look at the Bible, Jesus is there. His death and resurrection is openly in your Hebrew Bible. Would you accept Christ in your life right now? Accept Yeshua. You've heard this deal 100 times. Really? Well, Paul is saying that actually you would never know about it if you read the Hebrew Bible. And this is a brand new revelation of mystery that only the true believers have. If that's not Gnosticism, what is it?
Yeah, and on top of that, with the mystery thing you were talking about, if one doesn't understand this mystery language, it might go right over your head. You might just think this is just Christian stuff. But this language is very, very, very popular in the Greek world. The Eleusinian mysteries, for example. You have Demeter, who is represented by grain, Bacchus, represented by grape, drinking the blood and eating the bread, would be taking in the gods. You literally became Bacchus, and you go into a frenzy, and you became Bacchus. You were reborn, resurrected, death, rebirth, all those tropes that you're seeing Christianity all over the Greek world, way before Christianity is even a thought in anyone's mind. So my question, I guess, to throw it back at you again, what is your thoughts on that? And what do you think Christians are trying to like picture? What are they trying to pull from the Old Testament and say this is?
Christians are in an unenviable predicament, and that is they have ideas, core tenets that are completely alien to the Hebrew Bible, but they're, in a sense, stuck. As a Hindu once said to me, he said, Christians are stuck, they're anchored by the Hebrew Bible, which Hindus are not. And therefore, Christianity has to make sense in light of the Hebrew Bible, 2 Timothy 3:16, the passages I meant earlier. The argument of the New Testament is that the belief in Jesus is a fulfillment of your own Torah. If you would have believed in Moses, you would have believed in me because he wrote about me. John chapter 5. I'm not making this up. It really is there. I'm not making up these verses. The Christian Bible is repeatedly stating that you just look at your own Bible, Jesus is there. He's on every page. So therefore, you have these doctrines that are not only not the same, it's not a different orientation than Judaism. It's rather ideas that are opposed by the prophets of Israel. And now they're stuck with, well, what do? They don't teach the Bible to ordinary. You're going, but Christians now can read the Bible. They don't. Christians are not reading Jeremiah, and they're certainly not reading in the original Hebrew. And the church ensures that by not teaching their kids the Hebrew language. And it's understandable why the Catholic Church, would burn at the stake people who translated the Bible into the English language. Why do they kill Tyndale in that way? Well, because he made the Bible accessible to Christians, but they still don't read it. So what's happening is Christians are in the predicament that they have the doctrine of the Trinity, the teachings of Paul, the antinomian teachings of Paul. That means you don't have to keep ritual commandments any longer, and that has to make sense in light of the Hebrew Bible, and just it can't work.
Now, let me ask you this now. So we talked about this on my channel before, but maybe somebody isn't caught up, and we can go back to some things we talked about, last year, maybe some of the stuff that Christians are looking at the Old Testament and just getting it wrong. For example, like the virgin thing, or what other examples are there besides that?
Matthew provides 11 fulfillment citations that are completely, it's not that it's a misunderstanding, it's scandalous. It means the passages are invented, taken out of context, or chopped up completely. Paul, there are really two characters, two writers in the New Testament that quote extensively from the Hebrew Bible. One of them is Matthew, and the other is Paul. In Romans chapter 10, as an example, Paul is, we presume, quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Let me just give a background. Deuteronomy 30 is there to convey, it's the very end of the Torah, to convey that you really can keep the Torah. You can do it. It's not too difficult. It's not far off. It's not in heaven. Who'll bring it to us that we may do is that the word is near to you so that you may do it. And I urge you to look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 14. Okay? Just really simple, so that you may do it. But then we go to Romans chapter 2. Romans is the last letter of Paul chronologically, but more germane to this conversation, it's the most important letter of Paul. It's like the constitution of Christianity. And in verse 8, he quotes this verse. He supposedly quotes Deuteronomy 30, verse 14, where it says, the word is near to you, in your mouth and in your heart. Now, in Deuteronomy 30, verse 14, I beg you to look it up. The passage ends so that you may do it. So that you may do it. That's the point. The point is, you can do it. Anybody who tells you can't keep the Torah, don't listen. You can do it. Okay. What does Paul do in Romans chapter 10, verse 8? He takes a scalpel and he cuts out the last words that you may do it, which is the whole point, and deletes it. Gone, disappeared. How do you play with the Bible? How do you literally excise the whole point of the text? What are you doing? And if you're going to play with my Bible, you think I'm going to be a Christian? You think I'm going to convert to Christianity? This idea that you can't do it, this antinomian approach is found all over the place, misquoting Habakkuk, very famous, chapter 2, verse 3 and 4, where Habakkuk, I think in the Habakkuk says, is a prophet who says, look, be patient. Um, those who have trust in God, the ultimate redemption will take place, and the person who is really faithful will someone who is righteous will really have faith in God. Will have faith. Okay. Paul completely misapplies that in Romans, completely misapplies that in Ephesians, so that faith is what makes someone righteous. It completely ripped Habakkuk completely out of context. So that's routine in Paul. Now here's the point that I want you viewers to get. Strikingly, Paul was the great success in Christianity, and Matthew was the great failure. What do I mean? Paul was written with who in mind? Paul was writing primarily to a non-Jewish audience, right? People who couldn't tell the difference between chaff and wheat, between genuine biblical hermeneutics that Rabbi Gamliel would have engaged in, and the game of hide the ball. So his audience bought it. That's why Paul was so successful, because Paul was writing to non-Jews who were clueless about the Hebrew Bible. I mean, imagine the ancient world where you couldn't even get a Bible because it had to be handwritten. Matthew, on the other hand, who was Matthew's intended audience? Almost certainly Jewish people, right? Matthew, we don't know who wrote Matthew. We don't know where it was written. But we can be fairly sure that Matthew had a Jewish audience in mind, and he wanted to convince them to become what we now call Christians. Matthew, therefore, engages in fulfillment citations, quoting passages in the Bible that none of the other Gospels do it, certainly not in the way Matthew does. What happens? The Jews reading Matthew, encountering Matthew, go, oh, we definitely know that Christianity is a false religion. So Matthew fails because he quotes the Bible. Paul succeeds because he quotes the Bible, not because of the integrity, but because of who the audience is. Paul succeeds because his audience were ignoramuses. They had just no knowledge of the Hebrew Bible. Matthew's intended audience, Jews, were people who could understand the Hebrew Bible and knew immediately to reject the tenets of the church.
Wow, that's interesting. Now, I'm about to turn the heat up on you a little bit. I want to ask you this, and I can already tell this is going to be the intro probably. When Christians come up to you and say that all these verses and all these passages in the New Testament, like, you know, Jesus is carrying his cross is so much like Isaac carrying his wood, the only begotten son. Joseph is getting sold for 30 shekels. So is Jesus by Judas, where Joseph is sold by Judah. And all these things that are happening in the Old Testament seem to point to Jesus. What is your response to that?
What religion then could be dismissed? That means anything is possible. If you can simply take an event in the Hebrew Bible and apply it to someone else who suffered, died miserably later, then how doesn't this apply to Joseph Smith? I'll take a person who really, there are branch Davidians who believe that David Koresh, a man who died in a battle with federal agents years ago, David Koresh is the Messiah. And David Koresh is mentioned as the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. Really? I mean, the Messiah. So David Koresh not only died in this violent ending in Janet Reno. I mean, it was, but David is the name of the Messiah. You know, David Koresh came to Jerusalem to study in Israel. He went to the Torah school in order to just learn a little bit.
Right.
The Messiah's name is David. Koresh, the Bible says, is the Messiah. I'm not kidding. What are you talking about, singer? Well, as it turns out, Cyrus is not the real name of the Persian king. It's Koresh. That means it's
Yep.
anglicized to Cyrus. But if you go to the Hebrew, it's Koresh. See
Yeah.
the first chapter of Ezra. So
Aramaic.
David Koresh, and he died so horribly in this. And this is all Joseph. He was sold out by his own people. So
And he knew the scripture back and forth better than anyone else in the world. He was the guy.
right,
Ask James
exactly,
Tabor. James Tabor knew the guy personally. He said he could quote any verse. You can test him out too. You could be like, all right, let's see. You don't
right,
got your Bible in front of you. What's Revelation 3:12? Boom, he'll say it. Or
right.
or even the Old Testament, you can say, what's Micah 5:2? Boom, he'll say it. So people like that, what do you say about that?
Right.
Right?
So what happens then is if we can act so loosely with the Bible with such elasticity, events in the past where people died or people suffered or people Joseph actually survived, so I don't even understand how this applies. But anyway, if you could do that, then what religion could be dismissed? Moreover, I think people lose track of what the claim of the church is. What missionaries will tell you is that the messiahship of Jesus can be proven from the Hebrew Bible. They're not saying it's inferred from a story in the Hebrew Bible that we are then applying to Jesus without any text saying that the events in Joseph could be applied. So what they're doing is they're playing a game. They start off by saying this is the claim, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you've been living under a rock. Their claim is not that there's some story in the Bible that we can apply to Jesus. Their claim is that the Hebrew Bible proves that Jesus is the Messiah. And if you don't never heard that, it means you've never spoken to someone in chosen people ministries, in the Southern Baptist Convention, the Summers. That's their claim. So what they do is you go to them, okay, you're saying there's proof in the Hebrew Bible to Jesus the Messiah. Please tell me the proof. And that's what I do when I'm encountering a Christian, whether it's on a debate stage or on the streets of Jerusalem and New York. I'm saying, please tell me. I want to hear this proof, right? And then you go, what? That wasn't what you claimed. So you're giving me a story of Isaac carrying what up? No, that wasn't your. So what they're doing is they're saying, making a claim, really fantastic claim. Doesn't mean it's not true, but fantastic claims require fantastic evidence. And then you're providing no evidence. You're essentially engaging in what Paul did. The most egregious actor here is whoever wrote the Epistle of Barnabas. That was his argument. His argument is the Jews never understood their own Bible. That's a book that almost made it into the Christian canon. It made into some some Christians thought it belonged to the Christian. That was the whole argument, that you have to spiritualize everything. You have to spiritualize everything. Why is the Roman Catholic Church wrong? The Roman Catholic Church, the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church are rejected by these evangelical Protestant Christians because they're saying that the Roman Catholic Church are teaching, the Roman Catholic Church is teaching things that are not from the scripture, but really outside the scripture, from a tradition, right? Well,
Yeah.
the Roman Catholic Church, would you accept the Roman Catholic Church saying, but you could see it inferred because of the story? No, you wouldn't accept that. So why are you why are you playing this game? It's the same thing when they say they have miracles in their lives. Even those, the Lord changed my life, I had a miracle. I had a cold and 2 weeks later it went away. Really, the Roman Catholic Church claims miracles. I lived in the Far East. I traveled to the Philippines regularly, which is very close to Indonesia, and lectured there extensively. In the Philippines, people are having pancakes with Mary every Sunday. Why do you reject those miracles? Why are you rejecting everybody else's miracles and how their lives were changed and how they're not doing drugs and alcohol anymore? People are becoming Muslims. People become Hindu, whatever religion they are. People stop doing drugs, whatever religion it is. So why? And what they're doing is they're saying, no, only if someone in our sect, our iteration of Christianity, has a miracle, only that's acceptable. But if it's someone in the Roman Catholic Church who has the miracle of stigmata or whatever, no, those we don't accept. The appearances of Mary, and somehow Mary only appears to people in Brazil, the Philippines, right? She doesn't appear to anybody in Saudi Arabia. Apparently, she can't get a visa. Like, why doesn't the Virgin Mary appear to anybody, on the island of Bali? Why? Because they're Hindus there. They don't know what the Virgin Mary is. No, and in Bali, it's only Hanuman, the monkey god, that appears to people. Why is that?
Yeah, that'll pop up. Yeah. Now let me ask, because we've talked about the suffering Messiah motif that comes out of Isaiah 53, and you demonstrated on my channel how the text is talking about Israel being the servant. Christians take that, personalize it, throw it onto Jesus. Another verse that's being tossed at me lately, even by atheists, mythicists are tossing this at me all day. It's this verse right here, Zechariah 14:4, that says, "Then the Lord will go out to fight against these nations, and he fights in the day of battle. And on that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and on the Mount of Olives will split two from east-west, forming the great valley with the mountain moving and blah, 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 blah." Anyways, they say, look, this happened, and historically, Jesus was on the Mount of Olives too. So there you go. He's the Messiah. And so I just want to get your response to that.
So if I concede all that to the Christians,
Sure.
then all your work is ahead of you. You've now made the problem worse. Zechariah 14 is a messianic chapter. In fact, the entire end of Zechariah, all of it, 8, 9, 10, it's all messianic, okay? So if I concede, which I do, that Zechariah 14 is a messianic chapter, that proves that Jesus can't be the Messiah. What happens is people just stop reading. Zechariah 14 tells us that in those days, as God will be king of the whole world, he will be one, and his name will be one. Zechariah 14, verse 9. Well, that really didn't happen. So so what I would say to the Christian, if you're watching me now, I can see this. In fact, Zechariah 14 is clearly messianic. It's the last chapter of the book of Zechariah. Zechariah tells us that when this occurs, all the nations will come to Jerusalem and celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. Well, that didn't happen. Not only did any of this occur, but in fact, the temple was destroyed shortly after the beginning of Christianity. The Jews sent into exile. The knowledge of God was diminished, shattered, rather than expanded. So I say this to you, the Christian, I concede it all. That's where you've now created a big problem. This always, you I think are too young for this, but I remember Watergate as whatever, I was in my teens. I remember Watergate, and I remember my mother saying to me, so "This is the biggest thing, Nixon, Watergate, president." Right? And I remember my mom saying to me, "You see, it's the cover-up. That's what gets you in trouble. That's what got him in trouble." It's the cover up, stupid. Meaning, when you engage in this kind of criminal hermeneutics, you're going to get caught. Why? Because then you're exposing yourself. If you're saying Zechariah 14 is speaking about the Messiah, that's where your problems begin. They don't end there, because the whole end of Zechariah 14 tells about the whole world will know the truth about God. They'll celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles, and not only that, the last verse. And if you don't remember every passage I quote, the last verse of the book of Zechariah, that's 14 verse 21, tells that all the kings are going to be bringing sacrifices and offerings. Whoa! I thought there's no longer any sacrificial system after Jesus. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 18, Romans chapter 6. This doesn't, if therefore, if Zechariah 14 is about the Messiah, which of course it is, that proves that Jesus isn't the Messiah. Could there be a greater proof that Christianity is a false religion than Zechariah chapter 14? Think about this from a theist position. Okay, I'm an Orthodox rabbi. It No matter what you believe, whatever you, the viewer, believe, if God is behind this Bible somehow, it's a holy book, right? It would have to be meaningful to everyone. It couldn't be written in a way that only scholars and people with PhDs from Dallas Theological could understand it. I mean, whatever you would assign to the inspiration of the Hebrew Bible, whatever you believe, whether you're a believer, you quite whatever it is, but it doesn't make sense that the Bible is written in a way that no one can understand it. When anyone tells you that there's a grand mystery that no one knows about, you know it's a false religion. Why? Because the whole point of saying there's a grand mystery and there's special gnosis, special knowledge, is saying that's your advertising this is a false religion, because you're saying I can't base it on anything in a past text, and therefore this is something new. But how do I can't tell you it's new, because if it's new, that means someone invented it. So I say this is a grand mystery, a progressive revelation. How ridiculous. That's completely unfalsifiable. The Hebrew Bible says if anybody comes along later and says anything different than you know, kill him. Think about, I debated the person who I believe, and many believe, is the greatest Christian apologist in the English speaking world, William Lane Craig, and we debated on Christian television, right? And he made this claim. He's a very nice guy, he really is. He's a great guy, but he claimed this on air, that the doctrine of Trinity is some progressive revelation. And I asked him, how could it be a progressive revelation? You can't add to it, you can't take away from it. But think about this for a moment. The Torah is given some 3,300 years ago, and Christianity begins 2,000 years ago, roughly, right? So for 1,300 years, the Jews knew nothing about the doctrine of the Trinity, nothing, right? And it was very important to whoever wrote the Torah that the people who read it follow it. Like, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one.
Right,
It's
right.
and God punished the Jews for all those years for not worshiping him in truth. And then, here's the doctrine of the Trinity. The moment you say a progressive revelation of sorts, you then admit you have a false religion. Why do you need a progressive? Why would, on doctrine, how could there be a progressive revelation? How? Everyone has to know the truth. So Zechariah 14 demonstrates that Jesus is not the Messiah.
Yeah, because you had this law code, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Numbers. These are the words that are coming from God to Moses. Okay. In this text, they're telling Moses, here's what you need to do as a nation from now until the end of time. Don't change, don't take away, don't add, don't subtract. Here's everything you need to know. Done. Christianity comes along and says, well, yeah, that's cool, but we also have the Trinity now. We also have some other things too. We also, oh yeah, the laws, you can do them if you want to, but you don't really have to anymore. It just flips everything on its head. And so what you're saying is, if this was the case, why are we listening to Peter saying that he had a dream and that we can eat whatever we want, rather than what Moses actually gave us? And on top of that, as far as something like suffering servant stuff, if that's the case, we should have the kingdom of heaven being given to us by Jesus without a question. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to believe in it. We don't have to have faith in it. It either happened or didn't. You're saying that this is black and white. There is no if it happened, if it didn't. If it did, it did. Black and white, yes or no. And the answer right now is no. Messiah hasn't come yet.
Right. The Messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Bible are very, very clear. There's nothing mysterious about it. Isaiah 11, what will he do? He'll be a teacher. He'll judge people with justice. That's it. No, he's not a miracle man. He will judge the nations. I'm translating as I'm speaking to you. He's going to bring about a worldwide peace. It's really very simple. Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11 is very straightforward. What the church has to do is just dismiss all that. The New Testament doesn't even quote Isaiah chapter 2 for some reason and reinterpret text. Isaiah tells us who the servant who's suffering is. See, the chapters that introduce Isaiah 53, Isaiah 41, 8 and 9, 42, 6, 43, 10, 11, 44, 1, 44, 21, 45, 4, 48, 20, 49, 3. The servant is Israel. What Christians, the problem for Christians is they just don't read it in context. I challenge Christians on the street. Like, what does it say in Isaiah 54? I've done this many times. You can watch the videos on YouTube. They have no idea, no clue. How is that possible? They don't know what it says in 52 or 51 or 50. So by having this knowledge of only one chapter and the rest of the book, all they know is Isaiah 7, 9, and 53. So what is that going to do to someone? So of course it's going to be completely ripped out of context. So subvert Isaiah 2 and 11, pick 53 without knowledge of the chapters that introduce it. How much trouble are you going to be in? An enormous amount of trouble. That's what's going on.
Let me ask you this. We can end on this too, because this might be this might be the slam dunk right here for Christians to hear this. Is there anything in the Old Testament, like Deuteronomy, the Torah, or anywhere in there, that we get the words from God to Moses, for example? Is there anything that is said that refutes that Christianity can't be true because it says this, for example? Like, something like God is not a man, or something along those lines. Like, what do we have anything in the Old Testament that if we all accept, even Christians accept the Old Testament, that everything's fine, everything's true, these are real divine oracles being given to Moses by the Most High. We all accept that. What in there that we know about refutes Christianity just existing?
As for the wicked man, the person who sins, if he turns away from his sinful ways, I will freely forgive him. Okay. Is it my desire at all to punish the wicked? Is it not rather that he turn from his sinful ways that he might be forgiven? None of his transgressions will be remembered against him. Ezekiel 18, 21 through 23. The chapter is addressing the heresy of vicarious atonement. I mean, that's the whole chapter. So the context of Ezekiel 18 is that vicarious atonement is heresy, that the innocent can't die for the sins of the wicked. So, in a fundamentally, if we even sort of move away, get rid of the Trinity, the doctrine of vicarious atonement is baked into the New Testament, with the exception of Luke Acts. There you won't find it. Whoever wrote the third gospel didn't believe in it. And in fact, the passage that Jesus was our ransom in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, and Matthew chapter 20, I think verse 28, that idea is completely opposed by the Hebrew Bible. I say this to you, the viewer, would you want to live in a country where innocent people were punished and guilty people were exonerated? No. Would you want to live in a country where people who are innocent suffered for the bad behavior of criminals? Of course not. We would never want it. Well, why would you think that God would want that? The idea is completely unknown to the Hebrew Bible. You reject it. So why would you think that you're more merciful or just than God? So if God would never do that, if you would never believe something like that, why would you impose it onto God? It doesn't, it makes no sense, except it's very so the question, Neil, I want to just address is this: then why is Christianity so attractive? Like, then if what I'm saying in any way maps onto truth and of the Hebrew Bible, then why are people Christians then? Well, the answer is that Christianity addresses man's low self-esteem. When people look in the mirror and see somebody unattractive, they you know when people look in the mirror, they see someone who's not attractive. People struggle with their self-esteem. Christianity simply affirms and says you are a sinner. There's nothing you can do to save yourself. That's what's attractive, and Jesus will never betray you. Christianity essentially is man's effort to create God in his image, but the perfect man.
Wow.
Judaism is God creating man in his image. I remember this when I lived in the United States, going back 17, I haven't lived there in about 17 years. I remember when I would be checking out of a supermarket, you'd see magazines. Whatever, they wanted you to buy a magazine as you're paying. And I would look at who's on the cover of the magazines, actors, actresses, who are incredibly attractive, right? They're not average looking people, but
Mhm.
there's nothing else besides that. There's nothing. I don't want to name them, but what does this person have to offer? It's just attract. Well, that's what Jesus is. Like, why would an actor is paid to lie?
That's a good point.
He doesn't even come with it. Like, why is an act? They're good looking people. They're definitely above average looking people. No question these photographs are Photoshop, but they're good looking people. That's it. That's the whole deal. Jesus is what you will never be. He's perfect. He's not fat. He's in great shape. He's never bald. He's got he has gorgeous hair.
Right.
That's and Jesus is what you will never be. But if Jesus is God, why is he then righteous? Like it doesn't even make sense. Like, why
Yeah,
Jesus was
and
righteous? Like,
the
he would have gone
anointed
into
one.
a gay bar? Like, what?
The
Like,
anointed one is supposed to be anointed by God's anointed one. So it's
right.
God's anointed self. He anoints himself because he's and it's like and then that brings a whole nother thing in, and we can have a whole nother discussion about this. Is the idea of John talking about in the beginning there was the logos, and the logos was with God. The logos is God. Whoa,
Mm.
wait a minute. Why didn't Moses know about this logos that was there in the beginning? What's going on? Why is this being taught? Why is this the last stage of this religion all of a sudden?
A
And I
fellow named Chaim. I'm not kidding. You know him as Philo, but his Hebrew name was Chaim. Lived in. Here we go.
yeah,
What did we talk about at the beginning of the show? Where does everything wicked come from? Alexandria.
right.
That's Alexandria. We're not making this up. This wasn't planned. Neil and I didn't plan it out. We started off that Alexandria. What good thing can come from Alexandria? I'm obviously using a New Testament line. But Alexandria, so you have a guy who's a completely Hellenized Jew who visits the land of Israel, who lives exactly the time when Christianity begins. He's born in 20 BCE and he's dead in the 50s, right? So he's living exactly when everything happened.
Right smack
It-
dab in the middle. Yep.
right. So it's his influence, the logos, all that is Philo. All that is a Jew who's completely Hellenized, of course.
And it always falls back on Philo. He's the answer to everything. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't any last touches on this topic because I think you said a lot. I think you really did say a lot.
I think Jews are a very unique people. We can produce the best and we can produce the worst. We really are. I think maybe that's why we're so polarizing. We have produced the greatest prophets in history, and we've produced the greatest scam artists in history. I mean, no one can outdo the Jews, whatever your game is. I mean, you look at Paul. Although Paul is completely Hellenized, he was no doubt Jewish. Philo, these are the people who poison the world and produce really terrific people like the greatest prophets who ever lived, people who are willing to risk their lives on behalf of what they believe. Jews, I think, are high. That's why I think Jews are in the news a lot. And it's because Jews are polarizing. We have this ability to produce the best or the worst that society could produce, and look at the effect that it had on the Christian world. So yeah, that's the thought I wanted to share. That becomes so obvious with this.
I love having you on. It's always I always get something different every time, and I love it. So go and subscribe to Rabbi Tovia Singer. Links in the description. And I think you crushed it like always, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.